Welcome, everyone. I'm Colleen Mullally, the Associate University Librarian for Collections, Technical Services, and Scholarly Communication at Pepperdine University Libraries. This panel event offers an opportunity to encourage broader participation in conversations and actions around emerging scholarly communications issues. This is the 13th annual International Open Access Week, and open access events are taking place aimed at raising awareness about issues and benefits of open access within the academic and research community, sparking conversations with colleagues about open access, and looking for ways that you can help grow participation to open access and open scholarship. As part of Open Access Week, this panel is focusing on faculty perspectives on publishing open access. I'll be moderating a conversation with the two business faculty members who have collaborated on a book series they have made open access. In a moment, I'll be introducing our guests. Before doing so, I'd like to explain what is meant by open access. So what do we mean when we say open access? Well, it's free, immediate, unrestricted online access to peer-reviewed research and scholarly work. And everyone benefits from this because authors can share their work with global audiences without cost barriers, libraries can provide their patrons with a wide range of content more affordably, and readers can access the information that they need. The publishing costs are covered upfront through a combination of subsidies and institution fees, grants, author fees, and authors' rights are protected by a Creative Commons license. Open access matters because the traditional model for publishing monographs is limiting and often too expensive. A new sustainable model built for open access can preserve monographs as key vehicles for original scholarship, making them more widely available to all without the barriers to cost. So now I would like to briefly introduce our faculty panelists before asking them to tell us a bit about themselves. With me today are two business faculty who have collaborated on this book series published by Springer, Palgrave Studies in Digital Business and Enabling Technology. John Mooney is Associate Professor of Information Systems and Technology Management at Pepperdine's Glasgow Business School. And Theo Lin is Professor of Digital Business at Dublin City College Business School. And now I'd like to allow the two of you to tell us a little bit more about yourselves and your background.
Hello from Ireland. My name is Theo Lin. I'm the Associate Dean for Strategic Projects at DCU Business School, and I'm also a full professor in digital business. And I've known John for a very long time at this stage, and I suppose this was an opportunity for us to do a joint project together. And in fact, I think one of the great things about this became a kind of a collaboration between ourselves and Pepperdine, and it's one that we value a lot. So that's me from this side of the Atlantic. So
great. And as Colleen said, I'm John Mooney. I am a professor in the business school. Let's see, I think this is my 18th year at Pepperdine, and have had the pleasure of teaching and doing research in the area at the intersection of digital technologies and business. And so that then sort of is a short-term name for that, is this area of digital business that Theo talked about. Theo, if I'm correct, were you in that MBS program in 95, 96?
Yes, I was.
Yes, you were. So I thought of that this morning. So in fact, Theo and I are celebrating our 25th anniversary. About this time, 25 years ago, Theo was my master's student, and he and I would get into some very robust conversations in class around these issues, and those conversations have continued since.
Well, you have such a rich history together, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit together about how you arrived at your book series and what spurred this collaborative work together.
Well, this was all Theo's brainchild originally, and so Theo, I'm going to pass over to you for your original thoughts and how it came to be.
See, this is seniority at work here now, Colin. Let me pass this over. So I had sold my software company to Cambridge University Press and had joined DCU as a faculty member. And at the time, I was quite interested in exploring cloud computing in a much more detailed way, and had won quite a large national grant in Ireland for €6 million. So I suppose somewhere in the region of $7.5 million to set up a research center at the intersection of business and academia. And myself and John had discussed impact quite a lot about how do you get real impact on scholarly research, particularly around cloud computing. And John was very heavily involved in the MIS community in the US and worldwide, but primarily in the US. And I think that at the time, John, I could be wrong, John was visiting MIT with the CSR unit there, which is an applied research center, which is looking at how cloud computing would transform businesses. And I had asked John to come over to Ireland to talk to industry here. And what occurred to us was that the time lag and the amount of time it takes to publish in top tier journals, particularly in the spaces that we were at the intersection of computer science and business, was so long, and that the sector we were looking at was evolving so fast that really a lot of the content was going out of date by the time it got published. And on top of that, it's quite straightforward. Industry did not have access to those journals, and they didn't have access to that material. So even when you got published, really your content was hidden away on academic databases or in libraries or wherever. And that's no disrespect to libraries, but effectively, by the time we got to looking at the book series, open access was starting to take off in Europe. And I felt it was an opportunity for myself and John to edit a series of books, which initially dealt with cloud computing. And they have been a constant theme for the last couple of years, but that is changing now. That were probably ideas that would not necessarily be shared or published in top tier journals, because simply they might be too granular, they might be too far in the future, and frankly, in many instances, they might be too far out for a traditional business MIS journal, as opposed to they might find a home in computer science, but that isn't what we really want to do. We want to focus on the business side. And that's how we got up and running. And at the time, Palgrave Macmillan, which is a good publisher, was starting to explore that area too. And so we started discussions with them. And it's turned into a very fruitful project at this stage. We're about to publish our 6th book in 4 years. And we've accelerated the amount of books that we're publishing. So I think the first book probably took us 2 years to get the book out. The second book, 18 months. And this year, we'll have 4 books will have come through the system in a kind of a 14-month period. So our ability to actually get books through the system has increased quite a lot as we've got better at both identifying authors and structuring books. But also the success of some of the books kind of propels them along as well. So it's exciting, and they've become part of our research grants now. So in Europe, open access is less of an option now, and it's more of a mandatory requirement. So to not publish open access is the exception rather than the rule. And so if you get Horizon 2020 and now Horizon Europe funding, there's a requirement for you to seek open access publication. And so the book series, and I might add, in that same period, we've probably funded 20 or 30 open access journals as well. That is the current default position in European research. Yeah. So that may be different in the States now, and I accept that.
But let me add 2 pieces from the States, Theo, as a sort of the backdrop for my interest in this area. So I've been involved for many years with the Professional Association for Information Systems Academics. It's called the Association for Information Systems. And I've been in different roles as a consequence of being on the council for many years. And I've gone, as a consequence of those experiences, I've been in a lot of conversations about what is the role of a professional association of information systems academics at all. What should our strategy be? And of course, the high level thing is we should be there to advance the discipline, the subject area. And we should also be there to support the key stakeholders in that academic discipline. And they, of course, are faculty and doctoral students, and then, of course, master's and undergrad students. So supporting teaching and learning was a key focus. Teaching and research, teaching, learning, and research were key focus areas for us. So the teaching part is not part of this conversation. On research, one of the big pushes that we had was recognizing that there were not enough high quality journals in our discipline. And so as the discipline needed to have more scholars publishing top tier research, we needed more top tier journals. And so a lot of the work has been in developing new journals. Out of that conversation came the decision to actually launch some new journals that were intended to be high quality. And that prompted a lot of the conversations 10, 12 years ago, say, around the subscription model, right? So the association's been talking about open access. And so where we are today now is that our professional association has now launched some journals. It has effectively, I wouldn't say it acquired, it has given home to some other journals. And we now have we call this basket of journals, which are the top tier journals, but also a broader, what's bigger than a basket? I don't know. A larger container of affiliated journals, and we're really embracing open access. But for this reason, we are an international association, and we recognize that there are fundamental socioeconomic differences around the world, and that in Western Europe and in the US, we complain about the cost of journal subscriptions and individual articles. But when you drop those costs down into lesser developed economies and countries, it makes no sense. So we've had a conscious strategy of thinking about how should journals and indeed our membership fees be priced in different reasons. And open access as a principle becomes really important if your goal is to provide equal access around the world to individuals, schools, faculty members, and students who simply can't afford US and Western European prices. And one more thing I'll say, Colleen, and then I'll pass back to you, is I'm also, as a consequence of my associate dean roles at Pepperdine, being very much involved in AACSB, our primary accrediting body. And AACSB has very clearly adopted what Theo was talking about that's happening in Europe. It is a shift from measures that reward the number of publications in top tier journals and shifting to impact. And now a key part of AACSB accreditation is the expectation that schools can demonstrate impact. And impact means impact on practice. And so that's another big driver that kind of really prompted me to be interested in this whole area.
Actually, John, I think your point there about the international impact in developing economies is a valuable one. Like if you take SDG 4, which is equal access to education, and and I know Pepperdine has values, and actually many universities have values, and we talk about these values. And while many people might not be able to go to your university for a whole variety of reasons, when you think about it, actually open education, if you purely want a good reason why a university should back open access, it should be based on SDG 4, based on sustainable education and open access to education for all. And if that's the fundamental thing really about open access, is that I can understand the ivory tower concept of our university, and we have to sustain ourselves, etc. But when we publish content, that reputation and our impact in society is about maximize the amount of people who consume that content. It's a bit like, I don't know, Taylor Swift, or Prince would be a better example. Prince had this vast archive, 15,000 songs, and once he said, "Oh, I'm not going with the record company," he just released albums whenever he wanted to release them. And then, when he died, his family released all his music and they said, "Here, have his music." And the world is a better place, possibly for Prince, but it definitely will be a better place if we actually free out our research. Because the reality is that if people don't have access to the intellectual thoughts and the research, and this is what we do as a vocation, we don't build on the shoulders of giants, et cetera. But maybe actually the better analogy is building on the shoulder of lots of very small dwarfs. And, you don't know where you're going to find these nuggets of ideas and concepts that are maybe ahead of their time, but nonetheless, they're extremely valuable. And so libraries and librarians, they're there to help us discover knowledge. It's gone into here, all these books and here's the library. But in fact, it's really about discovering knowledge to help us navigate through this vast amount of data. And open access helps us do that, and particularly digital open access. Because that's the real thing here is, yes, you can buy our books in Barnes and Noble and all these places, but the reality is the vast majority of people download a chapter or a segment of those books, and that is a very impactful way of thinking about it, because we don't consume journals anymore. We don't really consume books of research. What we do is we consume articles and concepts and ideas, and all that's really happened is the technology has caught up in such a way to allow us to actually share those ideas and concepts in different types of ways.
I think you had more than one question, and you probably knew what you were getting into, inviting two Irish guys to have a conversation.
Yeah.
We'll let you on to your second question.
A question about cost, and the cost that comes back to the responsibility of the author to fund that. When you have a hybrid model for publishing, and you publish in gold open access, and it then falls on the responsibility of getting the funding to make that open, that's a critique and a concern for people in the publishing ecosystem. And so I'm thinking about our audience here and questions about that. I know that they're going to want to know, how did you do it? How did you get the funding in order to make your book series open access?
We're Irish, so it's a bit like, I think in the first instance, it was through research grants. And again, just to explain to some maybe non-European researchers and faculty and librarians, under Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe, when you make a proposal for research funding, you're typically, it's like an NSF type system. So you're asking for multiple millions of dollars. You're evaluated on three criteria: advancement to the state of the art, impact, and governance, how you're administrating the grant. And they are equally loaded in one sense. And so, at the end of the day, if you want impact is exploitation, impact is dissemination, impact is communication. And at the end of the day, open access gives you more readers, more people who are going to consume that content, potentially more people who are going to license or exploit your research. Obviously, at an institutional level, more citations, more recognition, more impact, more students. That's the kind of system. So really, we were pushing an open door when it came to the idea, hey, listen, we can take this research we've just spent 3 years and $5 million on, and look, for, I think at this stage, it was maybe $6,000 or $7,000, look at the impact that we can have. When you think about publishing in even top tier journals, it is probably a sad but true reflection of life that most of your focus is doing the research and getting it into the journal. And then once it's published, you've moved on. You may have actually moved on several years before. Do you know what I mean? And the reality is you don't really think about how many people are reading it or downloading. You might be thinking about citations. Citations may come into play somewhere. The reality is that's not necessarily impact. That is impact with a community of scholarly readers. So yes, you can say that you have impacted a small number of scholars. I might add, a citation doesn't necessarily that you've been regarded well, you could be cited and they might think negatively about your research. So a citation is merely a fact that someone has read it and has been stimulated to respond to it. So in one sense, a citation for me is just that your research was remarkably good or bad. And so you were saying, Colleen, the researcher should, I don't think the researcher should pay for it, first of all. And I was lucky I had grants. But actually, increasingly, I have used the excess from my various research, whether it was targeted research or exchequer-funded research, to fund open access wherever I can and to support other junior staff on doing that. And the reason for that's quite straightforward. It makes my centre look really good. It makes my business school look really good. The beneficiary of that recognition is actually the school. And I think that's really, really important that, open access is not necessarily limited to book publishing, etc. And you kind of say, or lower tier journals or whatever. So there are pure play open access journals and, their quality, I'm not going to say they're good or bad, I'm just saying is unknown because they're relatively new, okay? But if I want to publish in a journal of finance, there is an open access license for that. If I want to publish in MIS Quarterly, which is the leading MIS, there is an open access license opportunity for that. So the quality issue shouldn't come into play. So then it becomes a cost issue. And for me, it's quite clear. Junior faculty do not have the same opportunity to get funding as senior faculty, okay? And the people who are going to benefit from them publishing and getting recognition and impact is the university. So my basic thing is that I think universities should be more supportive of open access. I think they should be more supportive of junior staff. So that's two things. I don't think there's an excuse why to avoid doing a Journal of Finance open access license because it's $2,000, it might even be more money, $2,000 or $3,000, because the university has already sunk $40,000 into of time and that person doing that research, probably $10,000 or $20,000 in database costs, data collection costs, review costs. They've sunk all this money on it. Right. And so from a business school perspective, it's just good business to pay for the open access license for a top tier journal or any journal, because you know what? It tells more people that, hey, look, our researchers are getting published in top journals and you can access that for free. And look, we don't have to pay for imprints. We can just email this around the place and show people. And if it's from a library perspective, they should be doing it because it's going to ultimately result in systemic savings in subscriptions, etc. And I will tell you something from an Irish perspective, which librarians of America listen in. In Ireland, all the universities have come together and we've negotiated together with, for instance, Elsevier, that, or Elsevier, whichever way the Swiss want to be pronounced these days. We've negotiated that open access fees will all be covered by the system. So for Elsevier publications, no Irish academic pays the fees. We license Elsevier journals, okay? So we pay them a big chunk of money in the millions so we can access the thing. But as part of that deal, we don't pay open license fees when our staff want to publish in Elsevier journals. And so basically we're using the power, our buying power, to support our open access system. Now that doesn't go for every single journal and every single publisher, but I think we're up to about 17 different publishers where we don't pay open access fees, okay? Yeah. And so that is one of the advantages of being a extremely small country that's about the size of Orange County, or probably smaller. Okay, so we're small, but what we've done is our librarians have really just hit the ball out of the park in terms of being the negotiators to make this happen. And what they're effectively there, you can see that there's a systemic saving in the system, and everybody wins. And I just think the business schools, and you guys are much more, central in your communities and bigger brands. You guys are, you need to recognize the power that you have.
Yeah. Let me add a few things to that then too, Theo. I mean, I think, Colleen, the other part of this we haven't talked about before is the incentives for individual faculty. And Theo did touch on this, right? The incentives for junior faculty are different than they are for senior faculty. And for junior faculty, getting tenure is clearly like the thing that drives most of your decisions around this, right? So, and different people have different strategies, but clearly in the vast majority of universities, getting published is an important part of getting tenure, and getting many schools then give higher awards for publishing in top tier journals, right? The other part of the incentives that go on here, just to add to what Theo said, is there are a number of schools that now care about rankings, and this is the another part of the incentives that conflate our discussion here is. And so what Theo has said is that your mission should drive for what it is you stand for and what you're aiming for. And again, to our accrediting body, AACSB has fully embraced that. You are now accredited against your own mission, not against broad generic standards, right? And so what this gives schools is it gives them the flexibility to actively pursue their mission and really to be assessed against what they want to be known for. So one of the distractions are these published rankings, Business Week rankings, US News and World Report rankings. And Theo, I'm sure you have some of these published rankings.
QS and all these kind of things.
That's right. And Financial Times, I guess.
Yeah, well, we have our AACSB review next month. And exactly that, we're looking at where do we have impact? And when we're trying to say impact, we can point to open access in a very tangible way. A question for you though, John, just in that context. When you're looking at the incentives for faculty and looking at this idea of impact, and is that in the thinking, or is it very much around publishing these journals and this is the thing? So, because I asked that in the context of multidisciplinary research and interdisciplinary research, and the traditional journal structure doesn't necessarily support interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research in the same way. And that was one of the reasons that we looked at our own book series. Do you think that that's a challenge in US business schools?
So I think it is, but I think it's more of a challenge for the journals that have gotten most respect, right? Use the term we all use, top-ranked journals. Top-ranked journals are typically highly discipline specific, right? And so that's an artifact of history. These rankings that I was just talking about, and a great example of this is the so-called FT50, right? The 50 journals that the Financial Times says we will only count publications in these 50 journals as part of our ranking process, right? So that then creates these, I would call them artificial reputational factors of journals. And I want to, the point to highlight here is that's all very different from the context of impact. So I think a high level question for us as academics to decide, for our business schools to decide, for the academy to decide is, do we care about impact or not, right? And then of course we have to define what we mean by impact. There is this thing called impact factor, which has suddenly emerged by the journals. That is very different, right? That's really a measure of the extent to which academic articles are cited by other academic writers, right? That's a very narrow definition of impact, and not, as I think Theo used earlier, a holistic measure of impact, which is, are we as academics and as business schools and universities, are we having an impact on society or on the domains of practice that we aim to serve and in both educating future members of, but also in terms of guiding, in terms of new knowledge and all of that. So I think we're at a situation right now, we're in transition. There's a lot of artifacts of history, sort of top tier, top ranked, A, B's and C's, impact factors ranking methodologies. And I think they are kind of contaminating. Look, that's probably too strong a word, but they're confusing a conversation, right? And the more important conversation here is a conversation to me about access, right? Access to people who need to have access, who should have access, equal access, wide access. And Theo, I'd love you to talk about Wide Open before we forget as an institutional initiative at your university. And it's about truly impacting. It's about access and impact on the world. And for me, that's far more exciting than talking about whether a journal article has been published in a top-ranked journal that's really hard to get into, but in actual fact is only read by other academics who also want to publish in that journal. Largely, I don't mean to be disrespectful. It has value. I don't want to say it doesn't have value. In the grand scheme of things, it has value, but it needs to be balanced by these other more holistic goals.
I mean, I think that's a very valid point there, that when you, I suppose if I was a librarian and someone came to me and said, oh, I'm looking for, I want to do research on fintech, okay? You're not going to find that many relevant articles in, let's say, the basket of 8 MIS journals. It's going to be a handful. So you have to go beyond that, okay? So the challenge is, as scholars, are we there to publish for other scholars, as John says, or are we there to publish for a wider group? And if that is the case, why do we only look at the impact that we have on a very narrow number of scholars? And even actually, to be honest with you, that's a flawed thing, because we judge people who are in their 20s and 30s or very early in their academic career in terms of citations against other people who are in a much longer period of time, because naturally enough, the longer an article is out there, the more likely it is to attract citations. So, I mean, and so that whole metrics discussion is a different kettle of fish. I do also think it's worthwhile mentioning that when we think about open access, there are gold access and green access. I mean, you know, like, so people are often very caught up with the idea about the gold access because you have to pay a fee. On the other hand, you find that people still will not archive in open access. And I think ResearchGate has been particularly useful in that context, because people will put stuff up on ResearchGate, or because it's cited, it gets put up there. And I think ResearchGate has catalyzed quite a lot of usage, certainly internationally, around green access. So you're putting it in archives. But the wide open initiative that John mentioned is something that we're doing. We piloted it in DCU Business School. And that's around thinking wide around open access, because open access isn't just journals and publications. And in fact, the concept around libraries isn't just books and journals either. It's data and it's other types of learning resources. And so when we think about open data, I think it's a very powerful concept, because again, we publish our research and it goes out there and it's in a journal and we're very excited about our citations. But the power of actually opening up your data, and interestingly enough, this there's a long history of making data available in the sciences that isn't in the business and social sciences. Because why did you open up your data? So that people could see what your data was, and that when you recommended a vaccine or you recommended some biological thing, that the data supported that, okay? And so opening data has a very strong argument for opening data just purely on a scientific method basis. But the other side of that is, I'm very excited about journals like Data in Brief, where there is some academic rigor around how you format your open data, the value of your open data, and what the contribution of your data is to the wider academic community and research community. And so you can get a journal publication, which is a Scopus Q1 publication with Data in Brief, but only if your data set makes a contribution, has some kind of uniqueness, etc. And so I think open data is great. And the amazing thing is when you start looking for data in your business school, oh my God, the amount of data sets that we have floating around the place. and that people just don't use anymore, or that they gather but they didn't really do something about. And it's a massive amount of data, and it represents a massive amount of potential research for students, for future academics, for industry, etc. And I think that that is a very exciting area to look at. And we've expanded that further in thinking about how do we open up our learning and teaching materials, and how should that inform our policy around e-learning? And then finally, IP. So, you know, I totally understand how a computer scientist or a bioscientist or someone who's inventing new things might want to open up, but we generate IP in business schools, and we probably don't intend to exploit that. So why not open that up? And so when we think about open access, I think it's less of a policy and more of a way of life. And we need to think about that in a very fundamental way, in that what are our values when it comes to the knowledge that we create and generate in our institutions, and what is our role in society within the context of sharing that with the wider public. And if people genuinely think that closing it all up in a very nice box, in a very nice building, in a campus on the beach on the Pacific is a good investment, I think that's great. However, I think what we've learned about COVID-19, for instance, is those campuses and artifices that we create are not as resilient as we think. So the other side about open access is it protects that amount of knowledge, and it creates a means for that legacy to be exploited by others worldwide. And I think that's just a very exciting mission to think about over the next period of time, that, you know, in this time, do we want to hold on to all our knowledge, or do we want to share it? And, you know, I've been involved in doing COVID-19 research in Brazil. I'm not so sure how successful we've been, but we've been down in Brazil doing this research. And what's great about doing research with the guys in Brazil is we just open up everything. And, you know, the whole science community and the pharma community, which previously was a very closed research, we don't want to share any of our thoughts or ideas. All those journals, all the COVID-19 research and data is all opened up. And that's the really valuable stuff when it comes to business. You know, you can make billions out of the right magic mix. And I think about COVID-19, and you know, obviously, you know, it's having a devastating effect on many countries. But on the other hand, I also look at the altruistic outpouring and output that we have, that we've changed what we think about who should own some of this knowledge, etc. And in one sense, when we don't open up or we close up, what we are doing is we're not letting the world know about our ideas. And universities fundamentally were set up so that we could share ideas. And so, you know, some ideas are better than others, and that's right. And some ideas, people think they should be solidified and fixed in journals, and I think that's great. But I do think that most articles are just ideas that aren't shared widely. And what I like doing is I'm always constantly amazed and inspired by when I come across an article that has very few citations, and I go, geez, this guy was way ahead of his time and he should have had a greater impact. And the only reason he didn't have impact is due to probably the constraints that a journal had in terms of marketing at a certain point in time in 1981 or something like that, you know.
Or the reputation of the journal, whatever it may be.
And it's really, you know, when it comes down to the reviewing and editorial, I can understand in some business disciplines, finance, economics, etc. Yes, there is a rigor in terms of the quantitative analysis that they want to make sure that things, but largely one set of reviewers versus another set of reviewers, particularly in something that's very novel and innovative, it's a 50-50 chance whether a groundbreaking piece of research is actually being published in a top tier journal or not. And the thing I particularly like about the change in mindset, particularly around green access and archiving and pre-printing, is that those ideas are being shared earlier, quicker, and have the potential of being developed faster now than when probably I started in higher education or John started higher education. And the difficulty is the people who run the journals and senior parts and the tenured professors of the world, we don't know any better in one sense. There's no risk for us, but equally, we do perpetrate this type of thing that you should publish in these journals. And I don't necessarily think that holds as much weight when you think through it in any kind of logical kind of way. Yeah. And these divisions we put between journals, when you're at the very top end, whether it's, the top 20 journals, they're all really good journals and they're all really good academics. And I would find it very difficult. I sometimes go to conferences and I see this guy who's published in a journal. And I go, oh, it's only, for want of a better word, a Q2 journal. And I just think, I go, I'm constantly awestruck by some of the research that people don't think is good enough.
Yeah.
And
Theo, let's see if Colleen has a third question. I think we're still on question number 2. Colleen, back to you.
Well, thank you. I think you've been answering some of the questions honestly as we've been going along, and quite nicely and seamlessly. It does get into the idea of how you might advise someone who's entering this field. You're supervising doctoral business students, John, and you're working with others, and you've obviously helped launch the academic careers of others, as we've seen. So I'm wondering, as an established author and faculty member, I'd love to get your comments on what advice you would give to others who are considering where to publish, because we've been talking about open access, but should that really be the only focus, or just talking more about reputation and other key factors?
The fairest advice, Colleen, that we should be giving any faculty member is they've got to, first of all, identify what are the prevailing incentives at the institution that they work. It would be naive of Theo and I to give advice from where we sit in our institutions and at our stage of the career. So the first piece of advice is, please figure out through conversations with your department chair and colleagues, senior colleagues, and wherever else, truly what is respected and rewarded at your institution. That is a very important career planning part of it. But I will say also then that should be balanced with what impact do you want to have on your discipline, on your field, on your university in the long term, and on society broader as well. And at the very least, my hope would be that would motivate junior faculty to think about a portfolio approach, right? And so there's all sorts of, that's always been a smart strategy. It's a risky strategy to put all of your research into one bucket, into one project. So, faculty typically are better off if they have a portfolio approach. So that would be the second piece of advice. And then I'll build upon that and say, every indication that I see suggests that perhaps slower than it should be, we are moving towards the open access model. And what Theo said that's happening in Europe, where the largest funders of research in Europe, which is the European Union, now make it a requirement that 1/3 of the criteria is the impact, the real impact you have on society, on practice, is a qualifying requirement. That's to get the funding. And secondly, the other requirement is that you must publish in open access journals. That is going to come to the US if it hasn't already. I bet it has come for some funding agencies, but it makes perfect sense, especially for public funded institutions, which many universities are. The best value for money ultimately is going to be to have as much impact on society and on practice as possible. So that's the third broad piece of advice is this is the direction that it's heading. And I'll pass over to Theo, but I do want to also have people be aware that increasingly the professional associations are embracing this either explicitly or perhaps a little more subtly. Our professional associations, the Association for Information Systems, they already offer as part of membership of that association free access to the journals that are affiliated with that. It's effectively a pseudo open access model. You might say, yeah, but you have to be a member of the association. You do, but if you are a faculty member or a student in what is defined by the UN as a lesser developed country, membership costs $5 a year. And so for $5 a year, you have full access to all of the journals associated with the Association for IS. I would call it a pseudo open access model. And I will also say the Academy of Management is doing effectively the same thing. For a flat membership fee, you get access to all those journals. And within both of those bundles, there are top quality journals. And so it's just another part of this to weave into sort of the transitionary models that are evolving. Theo, I'll pass over to you for thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I would separate out the two issues. So I think the pursuance of an open access policy is germane to the executive deans of the business schools and the university administration. So they're either going to support open access or they're not going to support open access. And the reason I say that is that it should not come into play in your decision of where to publish, because fundamentally at this stage, I will put a bet with you that it's close to 70-75% of all journals will support open access in some form. And the ones that don't support gold open access, you still have green access. So from my perspective, this is just you are either supporting your librarians in helping people free the knowledge, or you're not. And if you're really supporting them, you're going to say, hey, we should set aside money for open access licensing, or when we're negotiating our contracts with publishers, we should include some kind of counter terminology that we're able to write off open access fees with those publishers. So the first instance, I don't think any faculty should need to worry about where the open access licenses are coming. If you get into the Journal of Finance and there's an open access license, I think that's your second decision is, do you pay the open access license or not? So that's straightforward. And if you can't afford to pay the open access license for whatever reason, there should be a gold access. If I'm a faculty member, I'm a more senior faculty, and obviously I am, and if I was a PhD student or I was a junior faculty member, the key thing is ask. They can only say no. But if you're able to justify it, there is not a lot of good reasons to say no in what I would call maybe Anglo-American developed country universities. We have the funding to do things. We would spend equivalent funding on lesser impactful things, okay? So, however, I think that you can negotiate those fees down to a much more reasonable number by negotiating these as part of a wider contract for subscriptions to databases, etc. So my first instance is, this shouldn't be a consideration for your selection of journal. It should be a consideration after you get accepted in the journal. And then the consideration should be, can I open access or not open access? To go to John's point about the associations and societies that people are members of, I do see that as a slightly different thing because it's a closed membership model. And what I would say though, I think the AIS is slightly different than AOM in the context that it is very difficult to get into some of the, like ICIS is a difficult conference to get into. So most conference papers there are at effectively a pre-submission stage for a journal. So the quality is very, very high at that point. And because they don't necessarily have proceedings in the same kind of way as in the sciences, you can access those materials. And you know if they get published, they have standing anyhow. So an ICIS conference paper also has a ranking. So it's a slightly different scenario. I do think for developed countries, that is a good thing. But the reality is the dominance of paper publishing in, for instance, somewhere like sub-Saharan Africa is a killer to people, because if you don't have broadband and internet, you can't access these online materials. And so I think that the reality is that open access in either form, gold or green, has a massive impact on society. And to be honest with you, it doesn't really matter where you're based. And I will give this example. I don't know, a couple of 100 people download my papers every week on ResearchGate. The US is the largest country, source country for those downloads. And then it's the UK, and then it's Ireland, and then various places around the world. And I don't think John for 1 minute is saying that a scholar in a US college can't access, but ResearchGate's pushing suggestions to them. And because I've open access these things into green access, I do find that I get a lot of requests from developed countries, or particularly sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, where people don't have access to those journals, and they will say, could you please send me a preprint or something like that? And obviously privately I do. But I think open access is less of an academic strategy and more of a societal requirement. And the fact that if you truly believe that your university plays a role in society beyond the lucky people who get to go to our college and enroll as students, then you will embrace open access and you will give your librarians and your faculty the support that they need to do this. And so at a fundamental level, I don't see this as I'm Associate Dean for Strategic Projects. I'm actually not the Associate Dean of Teaching and Learning or the Associate Dean for Research. But I believe our impact and our industry engagement and our civic engagement and our role in civil society, there is something about making those materials available to the rest of society in the same way that I would say open courseware, as distinguished from MOOCs, has, because I think it's a very different thing if you're trying to sell someone a certificate at the end of a MOOC. Whereas I think that if people want to do open courseware and they want to teach themselves stuff, I think that's a great thing. And we sometimes lose the fact that we're lucky to work in a vocation. It's just great, two Irish guys talking about vocations. But it's a vocation in the context of how lucky are we? We're in the middle of this massive pandemic, and we don't have to worry about our jobs, and we're seen as essential workers because we're educating people. But there's this massive thing where we sometimes forget that we're lucky to have the roles that we have, and we talk about values and things like that. But open access is, I think, the closest thing that we have to an embodiment of the values of sharing knowledge to whoever wants to consume that knowledge. And if someone wants to consume knowledge, why would we put barriers up? And it's a very different thing than I have students and I make them sit tests because, to quote Randy Pausch, those walls are there for them to prove that they deserve to get an award or degree to get to the other side. But when we spend other people's money on research and exchequer money on research, surely that should be for the public good. And I find it somewhat not reprehensible, but I find it doesn't sit well with me that we would think to put barriers up to knowledge. I think that we're lucky to live in economies that spend a lot of money on research. It's typically not the university's money on research, but obviously sometimes people do their own research. And if it comes from an exchequer, I think it should be a public good. And I'm not being a socialist, I'm being, I think, a altruist. So I think that at some point in time, our altruism should dominate the rational thinking around citations and whatever. And the real issue is maybe the journals need to consider how can they have a new business model that would allow them the open access as default. And I think that the universities would sit back and say, yeah, you know, how could we support that to happen? So I think that there's systemic discussions that need to happen. In Ireland, we can have that because we're a very small country with a very small number of higher education institutions, and most are publicly funded. In America, that's probably much more difficult and complex with a whole variety of different issues. However, AACSB might be the place for to have that discussion, or AIS might be the place, but there is a discussion there where we're focused on what should the individual academic do, or how can a librarian support academics, when actually fundamentally what we should be saying is, what can the associations and societies that run the journals do to change their business model in such a way to support open access as a default?
That's a great question. And Colleen, you asked us for a half-hour interview. I think we've given you an hour of material now to wade through and figure out what you're going to do with it.
Well, I'm very grateful for both of your time, and to get the faculty perspective. It's clearly a very complex, evolving issue that the pandemic has further contributed to the upending of higher education, and the publishing ecosystem are very much married to one another, and there's going to be great disruptions going on. There's a lot of conversations within libraries in the US right now about whether we're paying to publish and then paying to read, and how does that really affect smaller institutions that are not R1 size institutions. And from the librarian perspective, we have these conversations about holding down the costs and still furthering the scholarly conversation that is happening with publishing. And so from our end, we have our considerations, and it's just wonderful to hear both of your perspectives from here in the States, and also from abroad, in terms of what is making our publishing world go round, because without your contributions, we don't have the publishing ecosystem. So you're very, very integral to the whole thing. I do want to wrap up and be mindful of everyone's time. I didn't know if you had any final comments about how the library can be involved as a player in helping faculty with the issues around open access, and what you would like to see the library be involved in. We have institutional repositories where we can provide green access, and Pepperdine is one. We subscribe to Digital Commons, which is from Bpress, which got bought by Elsevier several years ago. So there's a lot of opportunities, but we're very much interested in hearing how to support faculty with regards to this issue. And as two people who have published open access, perhaps this has occurred to you, or perhaps you haven't quite thought about it, but I would love to hear any final reflections or comments about the library's role and how we can work with our faculty.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
I think it's interesting. I think the role of the university library is going to change rapidly in the near future, and I think COVID is going to accelerate some of that. And the reason I think that is because even when we think about data archiving and the role of archiving, I think archiving is going to become a much bigger function in libraries over time, particularly as we're able to capture more data. And so I think even though you might be a small library in a physical world, you can be a very big library in these new data worlds. And I think that's quite interesting. But I personally believe the librarian, the university librarian, and his team or her team play an extremely important role in bridging the needs and the requirements of publishers, but also of the academic community and the university community as a whole. And what I mean by that is, because you are the interface for subscribing and selecting and licensing and then guiding particularly students through resources, you play this kind of gatekeeper role with the publishers. And at the same time, if we truly want to support open access, we have to build a case for the administration in universities to say, this is something we should do. And as I said, I think that the nexus point is the library, because you're negotiating the contracts with things. So you have a purchasing power, and it's a very competitive field, academic publishing, and not particularly profitable. Okay, so and then the academic members are members of associations that publish journals. So I think that the librarian and the library as a community play a facilitation role for helping people organize themselves so that together the ecosystem is supporting open access. So that if you're John is a senior guy in AIS. So if you're John is going to AIS and saying, hey, what could we do to change our business model? And, getting all the members in Pepperdine or whatever university who are in AIS to lobby their local chapter to do that. And, that when you're negotiating with the publishers, that you're saying, hey, listen, can we do something on open access licenses? We publish in these 25 journals. We're one of your best customers. What can we do to reduce the open access license and do a trade here? And how do you organize yourselves to do that? And one of those things is encouraging staff that every time they put a research proposal in, they include the open access license fee in their cost. So that's going to the ADTLs and the vice presidents of research or whatever they might be called in your university, and saying, this should be our default position, that when you apply for research funding, you include whatever amount of money for your open access license fee. When you put in, you include money for your open data and archiving fee, et cetera, et cetera. And that these are not big policy changes, okay? And I'm not suggesting that you say everyone must do that, but it should be an exception that people should say, well, comply or explain. And if you have a very good reason why you don't want open access, that's perfectly okay. But I can't think of perfectly good reasons why you would not open access. And that kind of goes to the core, really. I can give you a million reasons why we should open access, but I can't come up with a lot of reasons why we shouldn't. And so when people say, no, I won't, what I'm quite intrigued about is, oh, why not? And I think that the reality is maybe 75% of all academics are relatively ignorant when it comes to open access and the implications of that. And to be honest with you, as you become more senior in university administrations, the likelihood that you're exposed or that's a priority for you is quite limited. So I think that there's an educational aspect of that, and there's a need for people to really quantify the impact and justify this on a very, I think, emotional level, that open access is just a good thing. It's just like, why wouldn't we do this? And when I sit back and I go, Yeah, great. Okay, give me that one reason why you wouldn't do open access. Oh, because lots of people might read my content, or lots of people might download it. Oh, the journals might make money. I kind of go, these are all not reasons. These are reasons that have nothing to do with university missions. They have nothing to do with tenure. They literally have no particular, it could be, well, uh, journals and associations need funding to exist. Great. That's just welcome to digital transformation. Okay. So, you know what? Business models change, societies change, and you have to evolve. And that's a reality. But they are not the concerns of universities. And they're not the concerns of the research community, or I might add, the library community. Our concerns is getting the right knowledge to the right people at the right time, and ideally giving them different perspectives on that knowledge so they can make a judgment and advance the knowledge of the world. And really, people's business models are, well, they can pay me to advise them on that, but as a researcher, I'm just kind of going, well, that's not my problem. Let's move on. You know.
Let me add a few things then to your question about the role of libraries, Colleen. So I think what you're doing this week with this seminar series, awareness, I do think there needs to be more conversation about this within the academic faculty community at universities. And I think the libraries can play a big role in that, in fostering these conversations and in educating people about what the options are and how it works and what the sort of upsides are. So that's a really good thing. I'll also remind you back to the story that Theo told us about what happens when a group of librarians can collaborate together. Let's not forget, libraries are the buyers in all of this, right? So in terms of changing the business model, we know from business that buyers have a lot of influence on changing business models if their buying decisions change. And so I would also encourage the types of collaboration wherever it makes sense, finding collaborative buyers. They will have a huge influence on this. There's no doubt. And we've heard what the University of California has done, right, as a buying group. But Theo's story is very powerful. It's a country of less than 5 million people, and probably 10 to 12 institutions got together and negotiated with Elsevier. Now that's impressive, right?
It's just not Elsevier, it's multiple publishers there. And multiple publishers. The critical thing is they want the money.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think the third thing, and I don't want to maybe push this too hard, but I do think the other thing that we need to do here perhaps also is embrace alternative providers. So I'll come back to the association I'm familiar with. So the Association for Information Systems offers an e-library that includes 2 of our top journals, Journal of AIS and MIS Quarterly, are included as membership benefits. And they offer university subscriptions. And so the university subscription, I think, is about $2,400. And so now what a library has is sort of different portfolio of purchasing is the other part of the purchasing, right? I do think that there's associations there that provide ways to increase access to the material that currently is not available. And I think that will help. The more material that's available in an open access basis, I think it'll help with this movement too. Those are my thoughts.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. And I wanted to just again express my appreciation for your time, and also for our listeners who really wanted to hear the faculty perspective. And bravo to both of you for your book series. I was delighted to see the number of citations that you have, the mentions, the downloads themselves, and just applaud your efforts for contributing in a way that really makes sense in distributing content and making it available out there, and looking at the journal publishing and saying that doesn't make sense for our content, that's not where it's found, and to provide your own way of getting that content out there. And clearly with the FinTech book in particular, that was a huge need, and you can see that it is definitely having a wide reach. So my congratulations to both of you, and thank you again for participating in this Open Access Week webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very
Pleasure.
much.
Thanks for the invitation, Colleen.